All right, ladies and gentlemen, hi everyone. Welcome to the year-ending Machine Learning and Friends lunch. Have plenty. Hope you enjoyed them. And this is also a talk we've been waiting for the whole year. Professor Sara Beery from MIT. Professor Sara Beery is the Homer A. Burnell Career Development Professor in the MIT Faculty of Artificial Intelligence and Decision Making. She was previously a visiting researcher at Google, working on large-scale urban forest monitoring as part of the Auto Arborist project, which I believe is the topic today. Um, she received her PhD in computing and mathematical sciences from Caltech in 2022, where she was advised by Pietro Perona and awarded the Amori Doctoral Prize for her thesis. Her research focuses on building computer vision methods that enable global scale environmental and biodiversity monitoring across data modalities, tackling real world challenges including geospatial and temporal domain shift, learning from imperfect data, fine-grained categories, and long-tail distributions. She partners with industry, non-governmental organizations, and government agencies to deploy her methods in the wild worldwide. She works toward increasing the diversity and accessibility of academic research in artificial intelligence through interdisciplinary capacity building and education, and has founded the AI for Conservation Slack community, serves as the biodiversity community lead for climate change AI, and founded and directs the summer workshop on computer vision methods for ecology. Wow, it's a lot of impactful things. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Sara Beery.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Hi, machine learning and friends. I like the name of the seminar. It's very sweet. Today I thought I would talk a bit about this Auto Arborist project that I started a couple of years ago at Google, worked on through the end of my PhD, and then did as part of my postdoc. And so I'm going to introduce the project, kind of go through the process of kind of where we're at now, but also introduce a lot of the kind of interesting open challenges and kind of open opportunities, I guess, for research in this space of urban forest monitoring with computer vision, and then finish up by covering some very recent work that just got submitted to CVPR, looking at going beyond 2D to 3D and temporal monitoring of urban forest structure. Let's see. Urban forests are kind of an interesting dimension when you think about global ecology and global forests. So this is a picture from Pasadena, where Grant and I both went to Caltech. And Pasadena has a really beautiful, incredibly thriving and diverse urban forest. It's very well maintained, it's very well funded. And you can see, it's beautiful, right? It turns out that these urban forests have been scientifically shown to provide a huge and diverse set of benefits to global societies. There are over 4 billion people worldwide currently that live in cities. And the urban forest does things like support regional biodiversity by providing habitat in the urban space. They reduce air pollution. Urban forests alone have removed something like close to 800,000 tons of air pollution annually. They sequester carbon. And, I think the contribution of urban forests to carbon sequestration is clearly much less than wilderness forests, but this is still an important thing that's kind of directly local and something that we have control over and that we can actually increase and expand. They help reduce energy use, particularly related to actually this urban extreme heat islands component. It turns out that areas with trees are generally much cooler than areas without, and that's by both shade and what's called evapotranspiration, which is basically in the process of the tree breathing, it's releasing humidity into the air that also reduces the temperature quite a bit. And so this actually means that buildings that have trees around them often have to do a lot less cooling in the summer, but it also reduces what is an increasing challenge globally, which are these extreme heat islands that are sort of already leading to human death in some areas. And we know that as global temperatures rise, urban centers are very aware that this is an increased possibility. So there's a couple different things you can do to try to reduce the impact of urban heat islands. one immediate thing is you can just put manual shade, and that does help reduce the temperature, but it doesn't give you all of these other benefits. So there's an increased interest in trying to think about planting more trees to reduce urban heat islands, but then trying to plant the right trees so that we know they'll continue to thrive as these ecological zones are rapidly shifting. Because the current estimates are that areas here, like in Massachusetts, where currently like some subset of trees taxonomically are thriving, in about 50 years, the expectation is that the trees that will be most successful here are the trees that are currently most successful in North Carolina. So this is moving quickly. And there are some areas where that's more impactful than others. So for example, areas like LA, there's an entire set of trees that are vital to the LA urban ecosystem that the expectation is that they are going to not thrive or going to actually die out as that increase in temperature and decrease in water continues to be a factor. Beyond that, it turns out that people who live in areas that have a thriving urban forest have increased physical and mental health. It's, for example, there's been shown to be reduced hospital visits, much lower asthma rates because, again, of the things like improving air quality for people who live in these areas that have a thriving urban forest. But it turns out that these benefits are really unequally distributed. So this is two areas of Los Angeles, Pasadena and Carson. One of the biggest differences between Pasadena and Carson is wealth. Pasadena is an incredibly independently wealthy area. And you can see that there is a really amazing coverage of urban forest. The tree cover is much higher. You move to Carson, you're going to an area that is more racially diverse, socioeconomically more disadvantaged. And even though the same legal systems are in place to try to maintain the urban forest across both of these, you can see that in practice, there is definitely not equality or equity. So one of the ways that you can start measuring that inequity is just looking at canopy cover. So this is a project from the urban ecology team at Google that is looking at mapping tree canopy cover. And this is actually currently deployed in over 500 cities globally. So they have pretty accurate maps that use usually high resolution EOS data to determine what is the canopy cover of trees in any given area. And then the nice thing that they've been doing, and something I think is really exciting, is they've been partnering with organizations like Tree Equity Score, which is an organization that explicitly builds at like these sub-city levels scores on the amount of equity of access to urban ecology that then can be used by local advocacy organizations to actually go to the city of LA, for example, and request that they prioritize areas that have been disadvantaged in terms of access to urban ecosystem and infrastructure. So by partnering with organizations like this, you help turn what is basically like a technology-driven product into something that's actually actionable by local communities. So this is really exciting, but it turns out that just canopy prediction is really insufficient to understand what we would like to understand about the urban forest, particularly when we're trying to move to this ability to adapt to climate change. So it turns out just knowing where there's canopy cover is not enough. We need to know the locations of individual instances of trees and ideally also their species so that we can do things like estimate water retention because it's different for different species, estimate carbon sequestration, particularly in terms of future growth, estimate this potential for heat reduction, and then also look at monitoring these individual species reaction and resilience to climate change so that we can do targeted and prioritized replanting that lets us actually, build cities that are adaptable or resilient to climate change at scale. And we also can think about maximizing biodiversity. So this is an interesting thing. Historically, humans really like symmetry and we really like things that are the same. And we think it's really beautiful when a single street has all the same species of tree planted down both sides all the way. And this is something that's this legacy often actually from older cities in Europe that then got brought to America from Spain like a very long time ago. So a lot of even very, very old cities in the US that were founded by the Spanish have this like these beautiful old trees that are all the same species all the way down the street. Turns out that's not the best in terms of biodiversity. But one of the things we're running into is there's this beetle, invasive beetle called the emerald ash borer, that is systematically wiping out populations of ash trees. But if your entire city has all of these streets lined with only ash trees, you're very susceptible to risk from this invasive species or to disease. So it's important to think about strategically planting to try to increase this diversity so that we can have a little bit more resilience. So this is Washington, Seattle, where I grew up. I grew up actually down here. But so this is basically what's called a tree census. This is the location of all the individual trees as kind of categorized and maintained by the city of Seattle and their genus. And this is something that a lot of wealthy cities does maintain. So they try to maintain, and they actually pay to have these censuses collected to maintain information about their urban forest. They're really expensive. So the city of LA has been doing one for the last couple of years. It's taken about 3 years to census the entirety of LA, and it's cost about $2 to $5 million. This means that these censuses are inequitable. Many cities that are less wealthy or are in political areas that might prioritize environmental infrastructure a little less tend to not collect this information because it's an expensive cost. They tend to be out of date. So the last time before this that LA did a tree census was 15 years before. And they also tend to be limited in scope. Like maybe a certain neighborhood is able to do this census. But again, that ends up increasing inequity because the neighborhoods that pay for the censuses tend to be the neighborhoods that are more wealthy. So with the Auto Arborist project, the goal was to try to figure out if we could automate urban forest monitoring with computer vision, right? Get to the point where we can actually do individual tree detection and species categorization in all cities on Earth. Big goal. So what we do is we try to use a combination of aerial data, but also Google Street View data. And the reason I did this project at Google is because Google has already collected ground level data of almost every city on Earth. And that data was collected for driving and for mapping. But it turns out that there's this environmental bycatch, which basically means we have this really great high resolution imagery of trees from the ground on almost every city on Earth. And then we try to train this basically genus classification network that takes in these two modalities of data and returns a location and a genus of tree. The issue is, to get this, you need labels for where the tree is and what the genus is. And so this pretty straightforward insight is that for the cities that have collected these censuses, this provides potentially a source of labeled data. So what we do, and this is a data set that we published a couple years ago, we combined these cities that had public tree censuses with aerial and multiple different views over time of the same tree. And then we associate that with a location and a genus label. And we've done this for 23 cities across North America that are split into regions, so West, Central, and East. And this was basically intended to make it possible to start tackling this problem at a much broader scale than was possible previously. People had looked at identifying tree species, but it was usually just, for example, only in Pasadena on sort of a set of like 16 square blocks. And one of the things that's true about this data set is for the street level data, everything that isn't trees, sky, and ground is blurred. This is to remove personally identifiable information. This was the way that we were able to publish this data coming out of Google, and it is the largest Street View data set that was approved for publication by an order of magnitude. So it's close to 1 million street level images of trees. But this process of manually verifying blur was actually quite comprehensive and quite expensive. So it does make it difficult moving forward to work with data that is proprietary. And as academics, I mean, I actually have kind of mixed feelings going forward about like how I'm going to think about collaborating with proprietary data, because while this is only possible because that data exists at scale that's been collected by Google, there's also a lot of restrictions around who is able to access the data, who's able to work with the data, how much we can expand from a public standpoint because the data is proprietary. So I guess all I would say there is just as an academic, there's kind of this balancing act when you're thinking about proprietary data data that cannot be public, and then the reproducibility or the expansion, or the sort of accessibility of the computer vision projects. So one of the things that comes up time and time again in my research, because I work on biodiversity in the natural world, is that everything is taxonomically structured. So it means it has kind of this hierarchical structure that is tree-based, tree-based structure of trees. But it's also very imbalanced taxonomically, right? So you can see that there are some branches of this tree that have a lot of sort of end nodes and some that have maybe only just one or two. It's also very long-tailed. So this is logarithmic scale. And what we've done, sort of following the Elvis data set, which is another long-tailed benchmark data set, we've split up the evaluation into frequent categories, common categories, and rare categories based on the number of training examples for that category in the training set. And generally, what you can assume is for the frequent categories, we can get good enough results to use now. For the common categories, there's definitely room to improve. For the rare categories, our predictions are 0. Like, nothing that we have is any good at all at categorizing rare species of trees. So, open research question for anyone who's into low shot or fine-grained recognition. So looking at just standard machine learning, just using a standard ResNet 101, holding out a few cities entirely for tests, but also breaking up each city into a train and test split that are like sort of locally split so that we're not memorizing certain streets. We train on sort of the full, all of North America. We also break down training on regional sort of splits, so training on everything from a given region. And we look at training per city models. And so this is sort of the entire set of cities broken down by each of these. And you can see the number of trees is also kind of imbalanced per city based on sort of the size and the sort of diversity of trees in the city. If we look at, God, that's hard to see. If we look at models trained on the full data set, they often do better than regional or city-specific models, but not always. And I think this is something interesting because we often seem to have the assumption that more data is always better. But if you look at, for example, Los Angeles, that's clearly not true. If you train just on Los Angeles versus if you scale up to training, which is like a couple 100,000 training examples, versus scaling up to the West Coast, which is now closer to like maybe 500,000 training examples, and then go up to like the entire set of North America, which is 1 million. Now, in these cases, you can see like the performance is really not changing that much. Whereas for some cases, it's very, very distinctive, right? So for example, Sioux Falls, if you go from training on just Sioux Falls to training on the region, you get this huge boost. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is like ongoing research. It's basically just like, what is the right training data set for a given specific end task? And I think that's a much broader question in computer vision than just this tree data set, but I do think this is a cool benchmark for trying to explore that, trying to decide in what cases should you train on what. And one of the things that's clearly a factor, a very large factor in this, is actually the distribution of species in any of these cities, because they often have, I mean, it's definitely not a uniform distribution. And the distribution is influenced both by where the city is located and what trees naturally thrive there, and by the decisions the city made about what to plant. So there's both ecological and human-driven distribution changes here. And this is just looking at the top 20 genera of trees, and just you can visually just see is the colors change, like how different these cities are in terms of their distribution. And when we now look at, so what we're looking at here, this is just a really, really naive, simple estimate of distribution difference. So we're taking the L1 difference between the normalized per genus distributions from one city to another. And also importantly from the training set to the test set, because those are also not necessarily true for any given city. If we look at this, you can see that there's clear blocks of sort of similarity here, like darker is closer. Now, if you go and look at the generalizability or the predictive accuracy when training on one set and then evaluating on another, you can see that there is clearly some similarity in sort of the structure here. So one very simple way to try to estimate whether a model is going to be good on a given city is how similar are the distributions. But of course, that's quite naive, and I think there's a lot more research to be done figuring out what is the best way to get a good model for a given end user or a given task. And breaking that down a little further, here we're basically looking at the generalizability of each training set. You can see that these diverse large-scale data sets are more generalizable, right? So this is training on the full data set, and the distribution over test sets across that entire city is much higher, and the sort of variety is much smaller. But it's actually really interesting if you look, for example, at training on New York City, just New York City, you get the same performance pretty much, generalizability-wise, as training on the entirety of the West Coast. No. So it's very, very systematic. Every single city has a training region and a test region that are held out, because what we found is that it's very easy to memorize, kind of overfit to given streets. And so if you randomly split, you get very high accuracy, but it's not necessarily predictive of kind of how good the model is. It's just memorizing stuff. So that's, yep. So here what we're looking at is the test set for every city, but there are 3 cities, 1 per region, that are entirely held out, that are included in here. We have 1 holdout city, but we also have holdout regions from every city. Okay, so then moving beyond this question of kind of what is the right training data, we also were exploring how to actually categorize things across these different modalities and these different views. So multiple street level views and from the air. And what we found is that combining information across views does get us the best results. But it's also quite interesting when you're thinking about data value. You can see that predicting from aerial data alone is just a really hard task. And that street level data, even just predicting from a single street level image, you basically double performance. So it's much more valuable, but of course it's also much more expensive. We collect this aerial data kind of by default. You have it at very comprehensive scale. Collecting data on the street, in this case, it's proprietary. It's not accessible to everyone. Now it helps, we do get another small boost by combining across multiple street level views, but it's not nearly the kind of jump that you see going from aerial to street level. Yeah. 30 centimeter EOS. In some cases, we have the resolutions are sort of worse. So for example, Washington, DC, the state blurs out a bunch of stuff. And our performance in DC is kind of bad because they keep blurring everything from the air, which took us a while to figure out. We're like, why is it so bad? They're like, oh, why is it so blurry by the White House? Oh. And then interestingly, we do get better results by combining aerial and multiple street level images. And we use kind of a mixture of experts here. But again, the gains are not so much, right? And it's most beneficial on the West Coast. And then we also find that it's even better if we use kind of this regional mixture of experts. So again, I want to be very clear, these gains are small, right? But this I think is interesting, which is if you train these mixture of experts at a regional level, how much the model trusts aerial data is different for different regions. Makes sense, right? You have different distributions of trees. But also it's quite cool to see what trees, are actually kind of being trusted, where these mixture of expert weights for the aerial data are quite high. And it's often things like palm trees or sort of very tall trees where possibly the street level data is not actually capturing the most identifiable information. Turns out a lot of street level data of palm trees looks like a telephone pole, just like a big stick. So the data set is released, it's public. You do have to go through this kind of annoying process where a Google lawyer needs to sign off on basically something that says that you agree to take down any street level imagery that a human is requested for takedown. So the process is a little slow. Again, one of these lessons learned for me about when you're working with proprietary data, but it is public and it's been released to about 50 universities now. So currently this is kind of the distribution of where we've been studying. But there's clearly a lot of gaps, for example, in the South. And so a wish list for the future is we're systematically expanding at Google and trying to include more and more areas. And our real goal would be to expand beyond North America and actually really expand this to a much larger scale. But one of the limitations, of course, is access to training data, access to areas that have done these tree censuses. So kind of where the system is right now, and this is ongoing work as we're like working to build this up and start actually deploying access to cities for at least those frequent categories to the locations of known trees. We start with city coordinates and aerial imagery. We build some geographic instancing. This is mostly just for efficiency. We try to determine where to collect Street View data instead of taking all of the Street View data from an entire city. That's petabytes of data for just city blocks. And then we extract relevant Street View data, do tree detection and matching, and then categorize an ensemble. And so just breaking down some of these things, one of the things we've been looking at is this aerial-only geographic instancing. So this is kind of hard to see here, but this is the results of our current model in terms of detecting individual trees just from the air. And so here, you take some tile, you use DeepLab v3 to detect locations of likely trees. And then we do these sort of local peak detection, and then we merge tiles into distributed NMS over sort of all of those tiles to determine the tree locations. And we've done this on most of our test cities at a high level in an aggregate sense. These do match, but there are limitations. So it turns out we're very bad at detecting trees with a small aerial footprint. Basically, small trees are really hard to detect from the air alone. And we also have cases where if we have like two trees that are very close together, sometimes we just merge them. This is just a challenge. This is one of the reasons that Street View can be so helpful, is if we do detect at least one tree, we'll collect the Street View data, and then we'll be able to see from the ground that it's actually two trees. Another funny failure case is places like New York, for example, where there's a lot of tall buildings. We tend to do a bad job in the shadow of buildings. So, TBD. So one of the things we've been looking at is instead of doing geographic instancing from only aerial data, we started actually including this additional modality to try to instance individual trees, which is LiDAR. So this is work with Tom Funkhauser and Kyle Genova at Google, where we've been trying to use weak instance level information from street level imagery to do much better 3D clustering over those LiDAR point clouds. And this does help us, what we found, to enable like association and understanding occlusion, but it turns out that it's incredibly dependent on how diverse of views you have of the trees. So one of the big limitations we've been having is like we do a really good job on some stuff and a really bad job on other stuff. We can build reasonable uncertainty models based on diversity of views, but if we only have one view from the street, there's very little that you can do in terms of disambiguating certain types of problems, because it's just an ill-posed problem. You just don't have enough information to do the separation. Now, another big problem we have, and one of the limitations of the data set, is that we do have multiple trees per image. And we currently have a single category label at the image level, but there's these confounding trees, right? We know that this image has other trees that are not the category that's labeled. So one of the things we've been trying to do is actually across these views do association so that we can basically just make the problem a little less confusing for our models. Here, trying to actually determine and detect and pull out the tree that is explicitly related to the class label. And so this is, again, ongoing work, and actually something we're using some of that LiDAR for. And then finally, in terms of multi-view classification, that's, again, maybe we want to do a better job than just ensembling, and we're working with some folks at Berkeley, looking at building kind of geospatial attention-based approaches to ensemble across these different views instead of just doing a mixture of experts. So important vision tasks, trying to do better with this multi-view classification, still an open problem. Also trying to do better 2D segmentation in Street View imagery. The big majority of reason for this is so that it's easier for us to release more data without having to explicitly pay for a human to verify the blur on every single image. And then we also want to improve our two-dimensional detection in both Street View and aerial imagery. And again, looking at potentially one way to start doing this is moving beyond just these 2D views and actually moving into the LiDAR space and continuing to improve on our 3D instance segmentation for these categories. I think one of the things that's really interesting when you're trying to think about panoptic segmentation or 3D instance segmentation of trees is that traditionally in a lot of the benchmarks, they were treated as a as a stuff class. So all of the labels are not instance-based. So there's kind of this like iterative process we're going through to try to get instance-based information from what is like very good semantic segmentation, but not very, very limited ground truth about tree 3D instances. So looking to the future, one of the things that's, you know, like as we zoom out, one thing to notice is that there's a lot of trees in a city that are not on the street, right? There's tons of trees kind of in people's backyards. Actually, maybe the majority of sort of the ecological input is possibly not coming from just the street trees. So we'd like to do a better job of detecting and categorizing every tree, but what we saw was that when we tried to detect and categorize trees from aerial data alone, it's really bad, right? So one of the open questions is, can we actually share information from street level data when we have it, this higher value data when it's accessible to the cases where it's not? We'd also like to go beyond just species ID and think about measuring health, structural integrity, and predicting growth. This is something cities are very interested in from an infrastructure perspective. They want to reduce or understand where to prioritize tree pruning to avoid hitting power lines or breaking sidewalks. And ecologists are very interested because they want to understand how tree health is changing across species as climate changes. And then another thing we're interested in, which is related to this, is actually trying to generate realistic 3D models for every species. And actually beyond just realistic 3D models, we want to generate digital twins of individual trees that are genus specific. And so this is the work that we sort of just submitted to CVPR, where we're looking at generating tree structure and actually these kind of digital twins of individual real trees. So we start from street level data alone. This is not really using the aerial data at all. We then use like a diffusion-based model, and we sort of train both 2D and 3D priors on those models to generate predictions of the kind of structural envelope of each individual tree. And then we use these developmental models to actually grow in a genus-informed way into the shape of that tree to generate a realistic and hopefully somewhat accurate, or at least more accurate than if you didn't have genus information, morphology of the tree that's actually on the street. And so what we do essentially, so you start with an image and a genus. So you actually require that you know the genus information from the beginning. Then we learned basically these 2D and 3D tree-specific priors for diffusion. And so we make use of a bunch of stuff under the hood here. You can read more in the paper when it's been released, but we're using stuff like SAM to get individual segmentations of trees. We used existing data sets for a subset of genera of synthetic trees that were sort of defined by ecologists and biologists to generate a bunch of synthetic training data to be able to generate these synthetic basically 3D tree priors. And then we use something similar to NERF to get this 3D structure and then build out this environmentally aware digital twin. And since this is from a developmental model, it's conditioned on the individual tree's structure from the envelope, but the developmental model contains information about how that genus interacts with different environmental conditions and how it would grow over time naturally. And so what this means is that not only do we get much better results than prior work on generating these 3D envelopes of trees, this is just qualitative examples. We have quantitative examples in the paper. You can see that, I mean, it's kind of unfair because there's not so many people who've really been focused on this problem, but the prior work looks pretty bad. And then this is just from the air kind of demonstrating, just one of the interesting things here is that a lot of these methods tend to be really biased from one orientation. Yeah. So we're using, there's like a set of different metrics that we're using. Some of them are just based on like how well it matches the different 2D views. And then actually using one 2D view, looking at another and seeing if it still matches. but there's other like sort of common metrics for like realism here. We don't have a lot of 3D ground truth, so it's not explicitly based on individual 3D ground truth. Yeah. No. Yeah, that's why I said it's not very fair. Like, we're actually really focused on trees. We built priors that are very tree specific. A lot of these are sort of more generic, but no, this is all from the public Auto Arborist data, the public data set. So this is completely reproducible by anyone. This is actually work that was done publicly with collaborators from Purdue. So not at all done within the constraints of Google. So it's fair, and we're doing from the exact same data, but again, we trained both 2D and 3D priors specifically for trees. So like our method would do a lot worse on other types of categories, and these methods have not necessarily been explicitly tuned for trees. So that's why I was saying, like, it's not a problem a lot of people have necessarily been working on. And for example, like some of these methods work really well for cars, which is like a lot of the interest has been in the past. Yeah. I'm gonna get there in a second. Yeah. But why we would want it. So that we can think about measuring and predicting urban forest change. And specifically this idea of having a digital twin of individual unique trees is that you can actually then predict growth into the future in this genus conditioned way and start understanding things like, for example, we can look at different times of the year when there's different amounts of leaf on and leaf off, and look at the explicit shadow cover and then that heat reduction corresponding to that from these models in a way that we were not able to do very well without this. Yeah. Yeah, so we have some metrics in the paper, but it's kind of actually what I want to do is much more systematic evaluation. And I think going forward, one of the things we want to do is write more like a forest ecology paper, where we're explicitly working with small subsets of given cities where there's very, very carefully sensed trees, and then basically just evaluating how well some of these types of growth models, for example, because the trees will grow around sort of like obstacles, or like, you know, because using these developmental models, they kind of grow into shared space. But this is based on the digital twin models are based on models that were defined and learned from real trees. But I can't guarantee you that this is actually the branch structure that's under here. And I want to figure out how well to evaluate that. One way would be look at the Street View data from the winter. So that's one of the things we're looking at now is we have images over time. So in some cases, we have images of the same tree with leaf on and leaf off. And so if we generate the 3D structure and the branch structure with leaf on, and then we evaluate the difference between the branch structure with leaf off, that's interesting. But then we have to figure out how to constrain the slight view differences between the two. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's basically what this is, right? Like you generate the estimated 3D morphology of each, and then you're growing into the space that those envelopes occupy. But one thing I would point out is that this is actually not realistic. Trees don't obey each other's space, they grow into each other. So it's like reasonable that you're getting this competing for space, but it's not actually super realistic. Like in reality, what happens when you have trees growing next to each other is that they grow their branches through each other's branches. So it's, you know, it's not perfect by any means. So then, you know, one of the cool things we can do here, we have this point in time, we can grow the trees kind of backwards and forwards based on these developmental models and anticipate what future growth could look like in, again, this genus conditioned way that's built from these models that were developed by biologists. And we can also start to predict things like the height, the diameter at breast height, and sort of the measured shadow from these trees. And we did go in and actually try to start doing a little bit of evaluation of how accurate these are. And we're pretty systematically, like slightly over predicting in terms of both height and DBH, but I think this is just something that we need more time to go in, calibrate, figure out kind of how to actually evaluate these predictions. Yeah, and again, just like looking at shadow profiles, I think with leaf on and leaf off is another cool thing. I would love to actually try to measure light differences for individual trees and figure out how calibrated these are. Cool, so thanks so much. I'm happy to answer more questions. If anyone has any? Yeah.
Great stuff. So talk about the difficulties of the proprietary data. So I have a two-part question, which is obviously there's a lot of stuff you could crawl out there on the web, and there are various ways to localize it, either through metadata or through pure visual techniques or whatever. So, you know, I'm curious if you've spent any time thinking about whether it's worth trying to scrape, you know, something to replace Street View, and that kind of thing. And then, A, could you do it? B, would you want to do it?
Yeah, so I mean, I have a bit. One of the things we've actually looked at quite systematically, just as another potential signal for this labeled data has been using iNaturalist data. So where are the intersections between where we have iNaturalist pictures of trees that sometimes actually capture more of what we know to be the identifiable features, like there'll be close-ups of the leaves or of the bark. And there is some intersection between iNaturalist and normal Street View data. One of the challenges with iNaturalist is every person is using a different camera setup, a different resolution. There's no constraints at all on the orientation of the camera. So that I think is potentially useful, but we haven't really figured out how to make use of it yet. Another big issue is just the localization is really inaccurate, like very inaccurate. I think more feasible thing, just in terms of like public access to data, is things like OpenStreetMap. So these more centralized repositories of basically dashcam data. And again, now you have a little bit less constraints on the sensors, so your models would have to learn to be more robust to different sensor types. But I do think that there's a path forward there, and I think you're probably better off working with something like OpenStreetMap that has some constraints already built in and people are uploading data for specific areas versus trying to just scrape data from the web. But yeah, for now at least, I'm continuing to collaborate with Google as like an external academic collaborator, and you know, we published that data on purpose so that there was at least a starting point. But yeah, it's an interesting, I think a broader interesting question in terms of like when you're doing work on data that is not universally accessible, like how much do you want to try to make things accessible to the broader community with the hope of instigating more progress, getting more minds on it, getting more fingers on it, and making it more, I guess, yeah, like less owned by someone, versus like the data exists on every city on earth, basically already in hand. And so if you can build the models to use it, then this is a scale that we really do not have anything close to with something like OpenStreetMap, which is not funded. So
you said it was available, but only to 50 universities.
So that's just the ones that have asked and have gone through the process.
Oh, I see. But technically, like anyone, like if somebody came from like a different.
I actually think UMass, I have to double check. I think UMass Amherst has already been approved. So I think you could actually go just get it, right?
Thank you. That's good because it's relevant.
And the process just takes maybe like, it takes like a month is the annoying thing. Okay. So if a new university that hasn't already been approved wants to go through the process, they basically have to fill out a form, and then a Google lawyer needs to share like a contract for them to sign that just says like, I agree to take down data and like keep the data set updated. It all has to do with personally identifiable information. You sign that, it gets approved, and you get a link to the data.
That a month isn't like being from medical data sets can take any months.
Yeah, but I mean, the personally identifiable information in this data is probably a lot less risky than medical data.
Right. Okay, but so in theory, any university could go through the process and try to get it.
Yeah, except for we've had issues with sharing with universities in, for example, China because of Google's policies around export control. So that, but no, it's technically public data, but this is again, one of these like lessons learned for me, like I'm like, oh, we've published a data set, but then sometimes it could be a little more complicated, and it has meant that I think it's reduced some of the kind of ease of use.
Well, some of those things really aren't up to you, so you.
Of course not, yeah, no, it's just a lesson learned. Yeah.
Yeah, on your genus classification at the national level, have you included any covariates on like climate or ecosystem or ecoregion or anything to sort of inform the model that like palm trees don't grow up here?
Well, this is the interesting thing. So in the results I showed, that was just vanilla. We have looked a little bit at introducing some of these environmental factors. Honestly, what we've found is like some of it is just kind of happens, I guess, by default, because there's something about what a city looks like that's actually also capturing the likelihood of a given species showing up. But also, if you make those priors too strong, the issue is that there's people involved here. So it's not like wilderness forests where you can actually explicitly say, like, no, there's not going to be a palm tree in the North Cascades, but there are palm trees in Seattle because people want palm trees and they plant palm trees and they manage them. So the human factor in urban forests means that you have much more diversity than you have in a wilderness forest. You go from some of these cities we're working on, like for example, San Francisco has over 300 genera of trees just in San Francisco alone. Most wilderness forests max out at about 15. So it's just a harder problem because of the human input, but also there's like the priors you might build from environmental character data become actively harmful for manually planted trees outside of their zone. Yeah.
I have a question. You were showing how like you blur everything that's not the tree. Do you give that blurred part to the model as well? Does that have useful information in it, or do you just extract the crop of the tree?
So far, we've been putting just the tree with the blur in the model. We did some experiments in-house of training models with and without the blur. The blur does reduce performance by a little. Some of that is actually sometimes we have to blur out parts of the tree because it's during the winter, you can see through the tree. Google feels very strongly that you should not be able to see any part of anyone's house. So that's part of it. Sometimes parts of the trees are blurred out. But the performance is pretty similar. I think it was like a couple percent. Maybe have someone else. Yeah.
At the beginning of the talk, you had this like nice motivation of providing actionable information to people on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And then you presented this pipeline to get there. Could we just skip detecting individual trees and regress those coefficients that was used to make those maps immediately from satellite imagery?
The maps for tree equity score are being generated from the tree canopy data alone.
Right. But now that we have that for some areas, can we experiment with a model that just goes straight from satellite imagery
to those equity maps.
those equity maps and then run that across the whole world?
You absolutely could. I'm not sure. I think that you need to do some pretty systematic evaluation of the generalizability. There's a lot of stuff that goes into those equity maps that's not visible from satellite. That has to do with like so the canopy maps, yes, and that's basically what we're doing, right? You can predict canopy, and we're systematically expanding and like labeling more data, and we do have it's like 500 cities pretty much globally. So there's a lot of coverage from just tree canopy. It's not that hard of a problem. It's kind of like class agnostic detection is just never that hard of a problem. There are issues where like if the EOS data was collected in the winter, you probably under predict canopy because they're definitely factors. But what goes from that to the tree equity score is like other information about like a given city's like ecological like budgets and like a bunch of other stuff that organization has managed. And so you totally try to predict them, but I'm not sure actually, like whether there's things that you just could not recreate because it's just not visible from satellite. Yeah.
A little bit related to what Rand's question was, so if you sample trees on the street, there's bias towards the trees that grow next to streets, like tall shady trees. So do you notice that in your global aggregates that you have a lot more oak trees than smaller trees in a particular region? Or? for places where you have more detailed surveys?
So. Yeah, that's an interesting framing of the question. I would say that if we just predict on a new city, we're very biased towards common species, the end. Kind of regardless, that's again, common species in the tree census. So more than just like, are we biased towards things that people plant on the streets? We're definitely just biased towards things that people plant on the streets a lot.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's a few different confounding factors. Performance is always systematically worse the further north you go. This really just has to do with sampling. So it's much harder to identify trees with leaves off than leaves on. Google Street View, we don't get to choose when they drive. And so they're more likely to be driving with leaves off in the north. So like Calgary, for example, a lot of the data, there's no leaves on the trees and it's just harder to predict species. We also see, again, like these confounding factors with like lighting conditions. For like New York City, for example, there's a lot of issues with GPS. I don't know.
Yeah.
So there's like a lot
like
of other confounding factors.
Maybe a follow-up to that would be, could you imagine like a human in the loop type thing where
Yeah.
you have these predictions and you
Yeah,
get
so
some people to get some data?
this is something we're actively working on, actually, which is basically how do we think about building like kind of a graph over like things that we think are likely to be the same species of tree based on the satellite imagery? And then how do you think about active learning on that graph so that you'd actually determine where to send a human from something like, let's call it an INAP BioBlitz, to be able to quickly bootstrap to what we think is a trustworthy census across the whole city. And there's kind of two dimensions of that. Like one of them is like, there's most of these censuses are done by companies. So the city doesn't often do it themselves. There's a few exceptions. So New York City's tree census is completely community science driven effort. Because GPS doesn't work in the city, they actually physically measure. They have community scientists go out and like measure from known points on intersections to trees. And they have actually then sometimes more accurate ground truth than like the sort of censuses that are done by one of the big companies like Davos, for example, that like driving down streets and like clicking GPS reads. But a lot of them are done by these companies. There's kind of three major companies that do tree censusing for cities. One of the things that I think, just in terms of like, how do you actually get this to be accessible is we publish maps of what our predictions are that then can be taken on. And so we're working a bit with, for example, Davos and thinking about what it would look like for that company to start from a predicted map. And then what's the active learning process, maybe not for communities, but just for this company to be able to drive less of the streets and therefore charge the city much less. So take the cost of a tree census from $2 million to $100,000, or where you have kind of this like constraint of these are experts, the cities already trust, they're already working with them, and a lot of them would work with them if it was less expensive or do it more frequently if it's less expensive. I think there's also a community science version that's very cool, which is like local arborist societies can kind of do this active thing and get to the point where they build their own map of the city's trees. But then the complexity actually politically becomes like, does the City Urban Planning Commission trust information that's been generated by the Arborist Society? So kind of TBD. There's a really cool tree ecologist named Jarlath O'Neill Dunn, who's at University of Vermont. He works a lot with these cities. And so we've been working with him basically trying to figure out what's the path to useful information for a city. Yeah.
So you mentioned about the lack in classification accuracy for the rare trees.
Oh,
Right?
it's like 0.
Oh, is that due to like the lack of samples, or is there some sort of confounding factors there?
It's a lack of samples plus imbalance. So if you're training a model and you have something that shows up a lot and something that doesn't show up a lot, this imbalance basically means that your model learns to predict the common stuff more frequently. And we've done a lot of systematic evaluation of different methods that people use to try to improve prediction on the long tail. It just doesn't work, right? Or you get like, oh wow, we went from 0% to 4% at the expense of like 10% accuracy on the most frequent species of trees, which then means the vast majority, if you look at overall accuracy, it's gone down to like 50%. So it's like, it's just the trade-off here is really tough. And I think it's a huge open problem in machine learning in general. We're not good at predicting on imbalanced data. My thought at least in terms of what do we need to do now, is those rare species need to be ID'd by humans. At least for now. But I think it's a cool question, like how do we get better at the long tail? And this is, I have never seen an environmental computer vision problem that does not have this. Yeah.
Do you curate the aerial data by season at all?
So it's a trade-off. So there's lower resolution aerial data, like meter resolution aerial data from Planet, that happens at high temporal frequency. So you could curate by season. Then you go to NAPE, which is 60 centimeter. We pretty much have wall-to-wall NAPE in North America, at least. Again, slightly lower resolution. At a meter, it's very, very hard to get anywhere close to something like an individual tree. Because like it's just the resolution's not high enough. If you go to 60 centimeter resolution data, it's still much harder than 30 centimeter resolution, but at least then we have NAPE data almost every year, but we don't control, like the federal government flies NAPE for the whole country like once a year. So depending on where you are on Earth, like, you don't control that. And then EOS, which is this higher resolution data, this is often something that a city has paid to capture for many other reasons that they might want to have like aerial data at 30 centimeter resolution. Again, that's now maybe every 7 years or less. So it kind of like, as the data gets more valuable, it also gets sparser. And so I think there's this is kind of also a pretty common thing. And I think it's interesting to think about, like, how do we make use of less valuable data that's more accessible? And then make use of that valuable data when we have it. But anytime the EOS data comes from the winter, unless we're in LA where it doesn't make that much of a difference, we get worse performance. And I guess that's the problem with environmental bycatch as like a thing, right? It's like cool because there's no way this data would have been collected for trees. Like no one would have paid for this, it was just for trees. But we can start trying to understand urban forests using this data that was collected for something else, but we have so little control over the data we have. Yeah.
Is there LiDAR data available for a lot of these?
There is LiDAR data from Street View that is completely proprietary that Google will not release. So we're working with LiDAR data internally at Google, but again, with the proprietary data thing, like I couldn't have a student at MIT that wasn't on Google payroll working on LiDAR, which just kind of sucks, you know? I don't know. So
What about aerial LiDAR?
oh, so there's aerial LiDAR in LA now because there's a project with UCLA where they've been flying drones for aerial LiDAR. There's also aerial LiDAR in New York City. So there's groups working on it. And one of the things we've been trying to figure out is if we pair that aerial LiDAR with, for example, the imagery we have from the street, can we do better there? But aerial LiDAR is, again, it's not, I'd say aerial LiDAR is less accessible than EOS, which is less accessible than NAPE, yada, yada, yada. Cool. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Yeah, I'll see you next year.
Well, I have more questions around.